Welcome everybody to today's seminar. So this seminar is part of the Identity, Democracy and Self-Transformation seminar series hosted by the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance and organised by Hans Azenbaum. Thank you, Hans. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I'd first like to acknowledge that the University of Canberra stands on the unceded land of the Ngunnawal people. We respect their elders, past, present and emerging, and appreciate their continuing culture and contribution they make to the life of the city of Canberra and the region around it. And we also acknowledge all of the First Nations people on whose land we gather. So today's speaker is Professor Moya Lloyd. She's a professor of political theory in the Department of Government at the University of Essex. So it's nice and early in the morning for Moya, and we appreciate her being here this morning. Moya's published widely in contemporary political theory, feminist and gender theory, and radical democracy. Her current work explores questions of identity, resistance, agency, and corporeal politics. And today she's going to present her work entitled Embodying Radical Democracy, Corporeal Disidentification and Sensate Agency. So thank you so much, Moya, for joining us today. So I'm going to hand over to you, Moya, for the 30-minute presentation, followed by 30 minutes discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. And thanks for chairing, and thanks to Hans for the invitation. For context, I thought it might be useful just to say that this project is part of a wider, this paper is part of a wider project exploring what I've called subaltern agency, which I suppose I'm using just to refer to the agency of those who are socially marginalized, displaced, excluded, you know, those that we tend to think of as socially and politically invisible, or as lacking a political voice, maybe even those who, if we follow Lois McNay, think maybe unable to do anything other really than endure their fate. And so my focus today is one part of the project, and it's under the heading, in my project at least, of performative corporeal politics, which is sort of centres around ideas about the performativity of the protesting body. So how the body might be, in a specific situation, the locus of struggle, a site of contestation, and a resource for resistance and politics. And so what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is what I've called radical bodily act. It's a term that Mike Fiola uses, but it seems to capture what I want to talk about, particularly lip sewing and what this might disclose about democratic agency. You know, maybe how acts like lip sewing extend or modify more commonplace understandings of agency in relation to both identity and its transformation. So this is very much work in progress. So I really would genuinely welcome all feedback. I feel like I'm starting sort of academic bingo by saying this. How many terms can I use? But it is genuinely work in progress. So I just want to put up two quotations about lip sewing that I came across when I was doing the research for this. I'm not going to say very much about them, except to sort of to say, well, if the mouth is the primary organ of speech, then what does suturing the mouth signify? How might we understand what this action is doing? So from Aristotle and Plato onwards, democratic politics, democratic theory has been associated largely with ideas to do with deliberation, linguistic exchange, debate, dialogue, speech, voice, arguments over decisions, judgments, policies, and so on. And language is not simply the defining feature of humans. Man is a political animal, if you like, because he uses language. Both written and spoken. He's what one thinker has called a literary animal, caught in the trajectory of speech and letter. And that's a quote from Rancière. The idea that democratic politics is indelibly associated with speech and language is an assumption that we find in both agonistic or radical democracy, as well as deliberative democracy. So a line of argument traceable through thinkers as diverse as Rancière, Arendt, Habermas, Chambers, Barber, Gutmann, Thompson, etc. And as Amanda Machin notes, scrutiny of the bodily is somewhat missing in much contemporary democratic theory, where logocentrism dominates, though thankfully this is beginning to change. Even, I think, thinkers like Arendt and Rancière, who stress appearance, and in Rancière's case, make a point of drawing attention to the sensate dimensions of politics, tend, I think, to underplay or overlook the corporeal aspects of politics. So my goal in this talk is to further problematize, if you like, this inattention to the body by revisiting the radical democratic practice, process of disidentification outlined by Jacques Rancière, in order to consider how it might help us understand radical bodily actions like lip sewing, which is my focus here. And so I'm picking up on some ideas I began to develop in a very, very recently published paper, in a special issue that Hans and Tainer oversaw. But I want to sort of take them a bit further, and I've been doing some more thinking about it. So the talk's in three main parts. I'm just going to map some approaches that link the linguistic and the corporeal first, as sort of background to what I'm talking about. Then I want to have a look at Rancière's account of disidentification and my suggestions about how we might read it slightly differently or how we might extend it. And then a third part will look at where these radical bodily acts fit and what they might disclose about democratic agency read through the lens of corporeal disidentification. And this is when I'll talk more about lip sewing. Given the hyper emphasis on speech, voice, language, what role do bodies play within deliberative and other forms of democratic politics? And I think a number of competing approaches have been put forward, which I'll just sketch. It's not an exhaustive list, it's just a range of different positions. And I think the first one conceptualizes the body's involvement in politics, in democratic politics, as a kind of supplement to speech and deliberation. So something that goes along with it, that's added to it, maybe that amplifies or enhances it, or is a byproduct of the linguistic exchange or deliberation, but that doesn't displace those things. So it might be a hook to draw attention, but the actions remain secondary to discourse, which is seen as the real locus of democratic activity. Others, for instance, Mendonça, Ercan and Assenbaum, have argued by contrast that non-verbal forms of political expressions, of which the physical is only one, the others being visual and sonic, are as significant as democratic talk, suggesting in their multidimensional approach that both the verbal and non-verbal can be deliberative if they follow certain rules, namely reason giving, inclusion and reflection. So on this count, reasoning can take place through images, sounds and corporeal performances as well as words. And I think Toby Rollo has also talked about sort of bodily practices and acts or everyday deeds, which qualify as democratic when they too sort of exhibit reasonability, equality and inclusion. Building on the communicative dimension of non-verbal actions, attention has also highlighted, and this is the third approach, the relations such activities generate between producers and recipients, or protesters and audiences. The language varies. And what these relations might indicate about issues such as, for example, the mode of democratic engagement involved, whether it's deliberative, agonistic or antagonistic, so the typology that Ercan et al. Established, or in a different vein, how spectators or viewers are claimed or interpolated by actions, particularly within the visual field of citizenship. So maybe the work of Green or Keenan. Attention often focuses here on those viewing or receiving the action rather than those participating in it, and whether the viewer, the receiver, is prompted to do something as a result of seeing. So raising questions about whether seeing entails a distinctive spectatorial mode of democratic agency, the agency of the onlooker, the witness, the viewer who is solicited to act. Such efforts are, I think, sometimes inclined to treat embodied protest simply as a subset of non-verbal protest, or as a distinct mode of fleshy political spectacle or bodily theatre. This takes me to the fourth account. First three tend, though not absolutely and not in all cases, to operate with a distinction between the verbal on the one hand and the corporeal or non-verbal on the other. An alternative approach associated mainly, though not exclusively, with phenomenologically influenced feminism contends that speech and deliberation are themselves embodied processes. As Diana Coole puts it, the body itself is never excluded from deliberative encounters, for it's only as embodied agents that interlocutors assume their place and practice their discursive artistry in public arenas. So through gestures, movements, facial expression, sighs, shrugs, so on, deliberating bodies communicate, sometimes unconsciously, in ways that cannot be reduced to what a body says verbally. As Machin puts it, bodies furnish the conditions for deliberation, in the sense both of enabling and limiting it. And I think, you know, of course, bodies are sort of literally necessary for speech. You know, for as Judith Butler reminds us, speech itself is a bodily act. You know, if we think about something like vocalization, you know, it's air from the lungs vibrating vocal cords and so on to make and produce sound. So the body is there. The final strand of work that I want to refer to draws on or centres on the democratic politics of assembly, whereas the quotation on the PowerPoint shows bodies and bodily life come to the fore. So this is where the body and the requirements of the body are, as Butler puts it, at the centre of political mobilisation. They are its explicit object, again to quote them. And where what is foregrounded is livability. So bodily survival, persistence, the flourishing in conditions of precarity, vulnerability, and interdependence. And this is associated mainly with the work of Judith Butler. And I think what's significant about this radical democratic approach in relation to the task at hand is that it considers speech as a bodily act to be just one way, but not the only one, of acting politically. It sees political performativity as taking place also through gestures, actions, ways of moving, sounds, etc., that, to quote Butler, are not reducible to public forms of verbal speech. It construes the way bodies gather in public as potentially part of political performativity. And finally, treats the enfleshed occupation of streets, squares, plazas as a mode of political and democratic claiming. And I think Butler's approach centres on what Cavarero has called moments of surging democracy. So, informed by insights drawn from this work, I nevertheless want to sort of tack in a slightly different direction, and I want to turn to the work of Jacques Rancière, a thinker not really known for an interest in corporeal politics. But here I've got, I suppose, two main goals. Firstly, to enrich Rancière's account of the sensate nature of politics. So while attention is paid to this aspect of his work, it's, you know, the capacity to shift a prevailing distribution of the sensible, to use his language, comparatively little has been made in this context, of Rancière's frequent references to, albeit not really explicit discussion of the body. The work of Laura Quintana is an exception. Indeed, the emphasis is more often on the interrelation of the aesthetic with the political. So politics as aesthetics, aesthetics as politics, something that I've already looked at previously in my work. But a sensate account of politics needs to pay proper attention to corporeality in its widest sense. The second aspect of the work is that I want to extend what's understood by disidentification to include insurgent corporeal acts. Disidentifications become an important lens within radical democratic theory through which to view democratic agency, but also issues of identity and identity transformation, particularly in relation to subaltern groups and populations. And Rancière has become something of a go-to thinker in this context. Rancièrean accounts tend to privilege a linguistic or discursive understanding of disidentification. I mean, there are other versions of disidentification that have a more psychoanalytic inflection, but the Rancièrean ones tend to focus on linguistic or discursive. And this fits with the stress on literarity in readings of Rancière's account of politics. So one of the main sort of ways, or one of the things that people often pick up is this distinction that Rancière draws between right names, which he associates with the police, or he sometimes calls it policy, and then wrong names of politics. And this is taken from an essay from 1992, Politics, Identity and Subjectivization. Policy, he says, is about right names, names that pin people down to their place and work. Politics, by contrast, concerns wrong names, so misnomers that articulate a gap and connect with a wrong. And I think the three main features to this account of disidentification in his work. Firstly, it involves a disruptive challenge by those who, to quote him, should not be speaking. So for Rancière, it's disputes about who counts as a speaker in political terms, who has logos and who doesn't, that institute politics. Those without logos, who only have phone or noise, he describes as being doomed to the night of silence or the animal noises of voices expressing pleasure or pain. So it's not that they literally lack speech or are incapable of speech, but rather that their status means their speech is not recognizable as political speech. So any political exchange, political interlocution requires them to make their voices heard. Second is there is a process of rejecting or disidentifying from the places and names assigned by police logic. And police logic is his term for the hierarchical organization of society into particular roles, functions, identities, regimes of the visible and sayable, and so on. So it's a kind of an arena of consensus rather than of dissensus or disjuncture. And finally, he argues that this process that he calls subjectivation takes place. So subjects are political subjects are performatively constituted. They're brought into existence through declarations or stagings of a wrong. And wrong is based on how equal standing is denied to some. And so one of the examples that he uses in this context is that of "we're all German Jews," which he acknowledges is no longer something that could be said. But he takes this example from the 1960s, 1968, and it's used by student protesters in support of Daniel Cohn-Bendit. But as he describes it, they took the stigmatizing phrase of the enemy, those who'd criticized Bendit for being a German Jew, and twisted it around, turned it into what he calls an open subjectification of the uncounted. What's important about this for him is that it can't be confused with any real social group, because many of those articulating this claim were neither German nor Jews, but that it creates an unspace, as he calls it later, within the police order. So a space of possibility, a space for new communities, for disidentification. So long story short, his account of sort of democracy, I guess, is that democratic subjects are generated through democratic politics. They don't pre-exist it. They're always in a process of, always in process, they're always in sort of becoming. So I think Rawls is right to argue that disidentification has profound implications for political agency. I think in part for me that's about disrupting and unsettling who counts, but I think there's an element missing, and I think that's the corporeal. I mean, we could already think of disidentification as being always already corporeal insofar as it's enacted by embodied beings. When Rancière talks about scenes of disagreement, for example, he talks about bodies assembling, and making political claims. So we already have the physical coming together of groups, and speakers are never disembodied, as Cole's already suggested. But it doesn't capture for me the whole range of ways in which the corporeal might be relevant to disidentification. And so I've picked out these two quotations that come from the book Disagreement, that I just want to sort of talk about briefly. I think it seems clear from the quotations that police and politics both implicate bodies. Police order is associated with the instantiation of specific ways of being, feeling, saying, hearing, doing. Bodies are moulded and conditioned by social practices and regimes of intelligibility that are constituted by and constitutive of the police. They are attributed certain capacities through this process, as well as a corresponding identity. They are made into, if you like, citizen, labouring, delinquent, law-abiding bodies. Police, however, involves what I want to call, and it's Rancière's term, although I think I'm using it differently than him, the disincorporation of bodies. So if police is about incorporation, politics is about democratic disincorporation. In a symbolic sense, the rejection of or a break with prevailing organisation of the body politic, but also I think in a more molecular sense. If, following Butler, the stabilisation or materialisation of policed identities rests on the repetition and reiteration of corporeal practices, then disidentification ought to be able to take a corporeal form through the reconfiguration, rejection, dislodgement of, or even renovation of embodied practices. So it might be connected to fleshy de and rematerialization. Now, one way this might be achieved is through everyday forms of experimentation, what Laura Quintana calls in her reading of Rancière's Proletarian Nights, micro-political displacements, which work incrementally to shift bodies from their assigned places. Or it might be secured through the kind of radical bodily practices that concern me in this paper. So what do I mean by radical bodily acts? Well, primarily things that are non-discursive in form. So we might include there things like self-immolation, lip sewing, sewing eyes shut, hunger strikes, and other forms of bodily mortification, as well as sit-ins, pray-ins, die-ins, and feigned crucifixions. So more narrowly, I suppose, today, because I'm only going to look at lip sewing, I'm interested in those that involve what it says on the screen, basically, violent transformation of the body rather than simulated violence or death. So not things like feigned crucifixions or die-ins. Those that are undertaken by subaltern groups on their own behalf, so not proxy protests, because there are examples, of lip sewing undertaken by an individual on behalf of or in protest at something that's happening to others. That's not my focus. And examples that are not straightforwardly or unambiguously political. Now, if I were to do this properly and fully, then I would give a proper account of these actions. So a much more located analysis, because context matters. I think it's also important to point out that acts typically have multiple, often contradictory meanings. There's not just one meaning that can be read off them. And actions will signify to both actors and onlookers in multiple, even contradictory ways. And I'm not claiming there's a ready-made or definitive set of effects or consequences that can be read off particular modalities of bodily action. But I'm interested in them from the perspective of subaltern agency and what they indicate about this. So I'm going to talk about lip sewing. I'm just putting up here what I've called an incomplete archive. It's a list of different incidences that I came across. It's often assumed that lip sewing is something that's undertaken by refugees in detention, and that's it. In fact, it's actually more widespread than that, as we can see. The first case that I came across is of the artist David Wojnarowicz, who sews his lips together as part of a piece, a film about AIDS, but does so largely in protest at governmental and societal silence surrounding AIDS. The list also, as you see, includes one from October 2007, sex workers in El Alto, Bolivia, who stitched their lips shut as part of a hunger strike to demand the reopening of bars and brothels that had been closed after protests by residents. A number of the incidences listed there do take place in immigration detention, which obviously has a specific impact on their whether they're able to gain publicity, on the impact that they have more widely. But even those involving other refugees or asylum seekers quite often, or migrants more generally, often take place out in the open, in public spaces. So we've got two there, one from December 2021 and one from February 2022, that take place either outside the headquarters of the United Nations kind of headquarters in Indonesia, or in a sort of open air camp where people can move freely about. So, as I say, if I were to do this in a more detailed way, I would look at these cases more closely. But I want to go back to onto a second point, and this is the question that I think I would just want to try and sort of end on. What kinds of agency are open to those, or exhibited by those who, if we recall Rancière, are not just only able to emit noise, to, as Mike Viola calls it, stammer, roar, groan, or howl, but who stitch their mouths shut, who stitch the organ of speech shut. What might we take from this? Now, critics and observers have often dismissed lip sewing as a cry for help because those involved don't know what else to do, as an act of desperation, as evidence of psychological distress, an act of symbolic protest, as irrational, absurd, barbaric, offensive, and alien, i.e., not acceptable within a particular community. But many of those who sew their lips shut consider it to be an explicit response to voicelessness, or perhaps more accurately, with regard to Rancière, to speechlessness. Having the human fact of speech is I think, no guarantee, as Rancière notes, that it'll be heeded or recognised as having political meaning. One Mexican migrant put it this way: we're going to sew our mouths shut so that they listen to us. One protester from the jungle held a sign saying, "Why don't you listen to us?" And the leader of the El Alto Association of Nighttime Workers is quoted as saying, "Tomorrow we will bury ourselves alive if we are not immediately heard." So we might see lip sewing as enacting corporeally both what it confirms and protests, namely the silencing and inaudibility of the lip sewers. Their inability to speak and be heard is made manifest through this suturing of their mouths. We might see lip sewing, my caveats notwithstanding, therefore, as making visible that particular groups or persons have been silenced or denied the right to speech. But secondly, I think lip sewing is also to be understood as a form of political claim making. Instead of assuming that all claims are made in discursive or linguistic terms, I'm suggesting, following Viola, that we acknowledge that political claiming can take non-linguistic or non-discursive forms, that it can be and is performed corporeally, that agency is articulated by and through bodies, but bodies that are done and undone through such democratic activity. In specific situations, flesh will become the locus of radical democratic struggle, a site of radical democratic contestation, and the means through which sensate democratic claims are made. So in the examples given, the act of lip sewing might be read as a claim that disrupts and problematizes ways of being and doing that are normalized, approved, sanctioned by police logic, an act that upsets established norms, maybe of equality and of agency, and appropriate corporeality. And then takes me to my final point, which is that when bodies affirm a capacity or occupy a place not normally assigned to them, they're engaged in democratic action. Now, as noted earlier, for him, this includes or involves the deployment of wrong names. I want to suggest that also we could talk about it in terms of wrong bodily capacities or behaviours by those of no account, wrong corporealities. And I suppose just to make a very final point in relation to this is wrong for Rancière is not about something that's incorrect or erroneous. It's an enactment of equality in a condition of policed equality. So it's inequality. So it's part of subjectivation. So the protesters are not simply victims of governmental or bureaucratic indifference, of draconian detention regimes or capitalist exploitation. When they stitch their lips together, the lip sewers mentioned earlier exhibit the capacity to make decisions over and take control of the very bodies they do not normally control. Their embodied actions, I'm suggesting, enact the very equality that is denied to them, but do so without the immediate or direct use of language or discourse. They make their voices heard by silencing them. Or put it differently, they engage in disidentification through democratic disincorporation. So, thank you.